Join us on an investigative journey as we educate each other on a scientific discovery, concept, or phenomenon.
Then we'll take a dive into the complicated and misleading world of gluten intolerance to sort the factual from the fabricated.
I'm Matt McCabe.
I'm Levi Bateman.
And I'm Sam Lozarica.
And this is Idio Facto. Sam, thanks for joining us again.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
We have lots of questions for you. I hope you're ready.
I hope I am as well.
So last week I covered non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and at the time when I was doing research it all seemed very complicated, and then while we were recording the episode it all seemed very complicated, and then after we finished recording me and Matt had a very in-depth conversation.
For about half an hour after we finished recording.
That's right, and we looked up more papers and videos and it all seemed very confusing. Before I started doing the research I was under the impression that non-celiac gluten sensitivity was basically all in the mind, and then it wasn't real. And then I started doing some research, and it kind of seemed convincing, some of these papers that I was reading. Of course, it's not entirely black and white, but some of them lent to the fact that there was this, at least a working diagnosis called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But it sort of doesn't really seem to be quite the case. So we've brought in the expert.
Did you?
Expert in inverted commas, I would say.
More so than us, I guess. So, Sam, had you listened to the episode?
I have. I listened to it over the weekend, actually.
Right. So, I guess some of the things that we said were probably correct, and there was probably a lot of things that we were saying that were not quite right. Do you want to sum up kind of, were we close? Did we get it pretty close to how it was, or did we totally miss the mark?
You did. Probably one of the biggest differences, though, is like obviously the access I have to publications is quite different. So I can get a lot of overseas stuff and a lot of stuff published in like smaller journals that you wouldn't be able to find, because there's not really a lot of good literature about non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
Okay.
It's all pretty poor, pretty small studies and that sort of thing. Yeah, you certainly weren't far off the mark, but it's a very nuanced and like dubious kind of area, so it's a bit difficult to get into, really.
My original interpretation of the evidence as I saw it, albeit 10 years ago or so, was that it was a set of symptoms that kind of matched a pattern, but not a pattern that was consistent, and there's so much self-diagnosis involved around it and not enough medical diagnosis and not enough medical study surrounding it that medicine is not sure as a profession that it's a legitimate disease that someone can be diagnosed with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And Levi kind of came with under the impression that it was a medical diagnosis, and that's what we discussed afterwards, was that is it or is it not a medical diagnosis, and should we recognize it as one, and do doctors in practice recognize it as a medical diagnosis?
So one of the convincing journal articles that I read was in the journal that I obviously hadn't heard of before doing this research, but it's the United European Gastroenterology Journal, or the UEG Journal, which to me seemed like a kind of credible source. And basically what this journal article was saying was that non-celiac gluten sensitivity was a condition that needed to be treated separately to irritable bowel syndrome, wheat allergy, and celiac disease, which to me made it sound like it was a condition that was listed in a gastroenterology journal. Yeah,
you're right. It's a medical diagnosis. It's not a disease. It's more of a syndrome. Because it's a set of symptoms that aren't at this stage really linked by like a pathophysiological process. It's a set of symptoms that a particular set of people are finding.
I guess avoiding foods that contain gluten, whether it's gluten or not, by doing this, you're probably also avoiding whatever the real trigger is. Would that be the case?
I think that's basically the leading theory at the moment. So in a few more recent papers, like within the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a push now towards calling it non-celiac wheat sensitivity, not non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Because basically all the studies haven't been really conclusive, but the evidence is leaning more towards that there's most likely a sensitivity to something in the wheat, but it is not gluten. So there's been a couple of blinded studies that have given people with self-diagnosed non-celiac gluten sensitivity like a diet with some gluten in it and some without, and then comparing the symptoms. And basically, quite a lot of the time, the patients can't really tell when they're having gluten and when they're not. Like their symptoms aren't changing.
Right. Okay.
So that would suggest that it's something other than the gluten that's causing their symptoms.
That's right, yeah.
And is it also partly psychosomatic?
So that's quite a difficult one.
All diseases are to some extent psychosomatic. Because, I mean, even pain is psychosomatic, really.
Oh, pain has a huge psychosomatic component. But there's also this thing called the gut-brain axis, or actually the current terminology now is the microbiome gut-brain axis. Essentially, what it's talking about is it's talking about the link between the gut and the brain, and how they communicate. Basically, there's a bidirectional communication loop between the gut and the brain, and it's still something that's really only quite recently been discovered. I think in 2004, 2005, the first link was found. But there's certainly, the more studies going into it, the more evidence there is for GI disorders having an impact on the brain and vice versa. So patients with especially anxiety disorders, but also things like autism disorders, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, they actually have a change in their gut function, and can, in some cases, there's some studies have shown some differences in the flora, in the bacterial flora in the gut as well.
Wow.
That's a long way of saying what I'm trying to say is we don't really understand. The two things we don't understand mostly in the body are the gut and the brain.
And they appear to be linked to each other.
Yes, and they have a massive link. The enteric nervous system, which is the nervous system controlling the gut, is insane. It's wow. Huge, and it can actually operate independently from the central nervous system.
I suppose from a diagnosis point of view, if somebody came to you and said, I think I'm gluten intolerant, which is something that you hear probably once a week, whether you're at a cafe or at work and you're catering for a function or something like that, most people know somebody that says that they have a gluten intolerance. What would be your advice to them?
So if they came to me like at work and said that they thought they were gluten intolerant?
Nah, just as a pal. Yeah, you're a doctor. We've got you on for a medical opinion.
Right. Okay, so if they came to me and thought they were gluten intolerant, I'd obviously go through their medical history with them, do an examination, and then I'd ask them about particular symptoms that they have and when they've noticed them in relation to food, and when they've noticed them in relation to passing bowel motions, and then obviously what types of food they've been having and that sort of thing. Basically, there's three kind of gluten-related disorders. There's gluten intolerance, including celiac disease, wheat allergy, and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And then there's irritable bowel syndrome. So the main thing we need to exclude for a gluten intolerance is celiac disease, because that has the worst long-term effects.
And it's actually, it can damage your gut permanently, can it?
Yeah, it causes lots of issues and can cause vitamin deficiencies and a whole heap of very not nice consequences down the line. The big issue with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or I might just start referring to it as non-celiac wheat sensitivity for now, is there's no biomarker to look for like we do in celiac disease. Can't look at blood tests. We can look at blood tests to exclude celiac, but we can't look into diagnose non-celiac wheat sensitivity. So the other issue is there's other things in wheat that can cause an immune or inflammatory response. So there is the wheat allergy, which is just a classic food allergy, whereas other components in the wheat can actually trigger more inflammatory responses. So the amylase trypsin inhibitors, fructans, wheat germ agglutinins can also kind of elicit the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines and cause immune and inflammatory responses and similar kind of symptoms.
So these are all components that if you required a FODMAP-free diet would trigger a gut response in you.
That's right, yeah. And that's the thing, is a low FODMAP diet is our treatment of choice for irritable bowel syndrome, but that's also what you're going to be getting. So if you go on a low FODMAP diet, then you're obviously eliminating gluten and wheat. So you're eliminating these things as well, which is a good and bad thing, because it's good because obviously the symptoms are improving, but it's bad because it's difficult for diagnostic purposes. How
do you distinguish then between IBS and non-celiac wheat sensitivity, if basically the way you diagnose is by a low FODMAP diet, which can be for either?
Yeah. So that's one of the big issues with diagnosing non-celiac wheat sensitivity. And there's a diagnostic criteria that was released in 2015, and this was for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But basically, it's really complex, and I won't go into the details because I looked at the thing about 5 times and I still didn't particularly understand it. But basically what you do is you have a gluten-containing diet for a while, and then you start taking these questionnaires. They're standardized questionnaires, and that monitors your symptoms throughout this process. And then you go on a gluten-free diet for 6 weeks. Obviously, if you haven't improved on the gluten-free diet, then non-celiac gluten sensitivity is excluded. But if you have improved, then you go through this process of continuing the gluten-free diet and then starting either a placebo or gluten back in the diet. And then you do this in 1 week stages. And you keep doing these questionnaires frequently throughout these stages. And you bring in either placebo or gluten, and then you go back to a gluten-free, and then you bring in the other, and then you go back to gluten-free. And with that process, if you actually manage to make it through that process and are compliant with it, then you possibly can come up with the diagnosis of non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
That is the kicker, isn't it? And despite the now hours of discussion that we've all had about this, the main message remains don't self-diagnose.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to get there by yourself, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, pretty much. And basically, it's something that we don't understand really either at this point. There's still a lot more research going into it. But obviously, the difficulty with, or the danger with self-diagnosis is then vast majority of people who self-diagnose then self-treat. And self-diagnosis isn't really the problem. It's the self-treatment is the problem, because they'll eliminate gluten. But then they're either, as Levi was talking about last week, if you're having gluten-free products, then what are you having instead of the gluten? You're having more carbs, more sugar, having different preservative.
Well, I agree with you there, but I, as a skeptic, would also argue that self-diagnosis is a large part of the problem because it inflates something like non-celiac wheat sensitivity to seem like it is in fact a problem needs to be fixed, when if you went to a doctor and got diagnosed properly, it may not even exist. And most of the literature that I've read said that if it does exist, it affects a very small number of people.
So it looks like we may need to, as with all things, keep studying it, get better at the diagnosis, but also stop self-diagnosing and possibly rename let's call it a syndrome, because that's what you've referred to it a few times, to be a non-celiac wheat sensitivity.
Yeah, I think that's the most recent papers I've looked at are certainly leaning towards calling it non-celiac wheat sensitivity rather than non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
Which makes much more sense, because if it's the fructans and the other components of wheat that are giving you the undesirable gut activity, then of course, it's, why is gluten getting a bad rap?
Yeah. But, as with a lot of things in medicine, nothing's absolute. It's very rare that we have black and white answers to questions.
And that's the thing about medicine, especially modern medicine, is that it's constantly changing and constantly being updated. And that's the hard part about being a doctor, I guess, is keeping up with that literature.
Yes, there is a lot of it.
And the fact that your friend told you about a certain disease when you were in high school, or even a couple of weeks ago that they learnt off their neighbour, probably isn't as up to date or accurate as what your doctor could tell you. So, as with most things, if you've got something wrong with you, or if you think you might have something wrong with you, the best thing to do is go and see a health professional.
I think that's probably could be the subtitle of the podcast, Idio Facto, or Go and See Your Doctor.
Yeah.
All right, Sam, do you want to stick around for the rest of the show?
Yeah, stick around, Sam, because it's pretty exciting. I'm going to be talking about homing pigeons.
Yes, I'm actually super excited about that.
Well, I had to get specific into homing pigeons. Originally, this episode was going to be called, my part of the episode was going to be called Animal Navigation. I just assumed, all animals will navigate the same, but of course, there's so many different types. There's bird migration, mammal migration, like we see in the wildebeest. There's migration of sea animals that have got to contend with ocean currents and temperature differentials and things, whales and turtles.
And swimming upstream.
That's right. And
like salmon.
I started to look into it, and all of these different animals use potentially different mechanisms, or a combination of different mechanisms to navigate. So
I feel like we say this every week. It's way more complex than it first seems.
Maybe that should be the subtitle of the show.
Yeah. It's Idio Facto, or Go See Your Doctor, or it's more complicated than we first thought.
Yeah, well, I'd have to agree with that. If I was going to be covering animal navigation, it'd be a very long episode, but I think it already is going to be a very long episode with the bloody waffle from that rubbish doctor at the start. But
Yeah, sorry. Cut back on as much of mine as you want.
No, it's okay. I'll find some good stuff in there. It's good.
And probably a few bloopers as well.
Yeah, don't worry about that. I'll make you sound stupid.
So, the homing pigeon. Basically, they all come from the rock dove or the rock pigeon. Basically just the common pigeon. The scientific name is Columba livia. So the domesticated version is Columbia livia domestica. So just domesticated pigeon, essentially. Naturally, their range was through Europe, North and South Europe, Northern Africa, and then eventually extending into Asia. But now, you can pretty much find these pigeons all over the world. People call them rats of the sky. You tend to see them all around cities, anywhere where people might leave food. There's just pigeons everywhere. And something interesting that I learned in the research of this show was that baby pigeons have a name.
Yes, go on.
They're called squabs.
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 That's pretty cool.
Yep. Little fun fact there. Whip that one at the next dinner party.
Yeah, you'll sound like the smartest guy in the room.
How to make friends and influence
Hey,
people.
does anyone know that a baby pigeon is called a squab? You'll be a fun guy, that's for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully some of our listeners find it more interesting than my co-host.
I liked it, Levi.
Oh, thank you.
You sucker.
So these rock doves or these homing pigeons are pretty amazing. So the wild rock dove or pigeon has this amazing ability to navigate its way back home over incredibly long distances. And so the domesticated pigeon are just basically rock pigeons that have been selectively bred based on how well or how quickly they were able to return home after being taken away from their home and then released from a box.
Right, so much like we bred dogs from wolves to, such specific purposes like going down a foxhole sort of thing with...
Exactly. We gave them jobs. We gave the wolves jobs and we kept the ones that didn't kill us as much, and we bred those with their babies that didn't kill us quite as much as well. And then once we had these dogs that liked our company, then we gave them jobs and we...
That is the prime characteristic that I look for in a dog is it going to kill me? No, excellent. I'll take it.
Well, it's the reason that I chose my dog. Me and Chrissy chose our dog based on the fact that when we met it didn't kill us. So
yeah, well, that's always a good policy.
What about the ones you met before?
Well, we don't talk about those.
They've actually died several times, Sam, so...
It's very unfortunate. Very strenuous process, trying to pick out a new dog.
They give you sympathy. So basically, these rock doves can travel incredibly long distances and they can easily cover in a single journey over 500 kilometres. And I read journeys of up to 1,800 kilometres have been recorded.
Oh my God.
So taking the pigeon that far away from their home, releasing it in a place that it's never been before, and it will return to its nesting box, essentially. Its loft,
but
they
like
call them.
in a single journey, like, does it rest?
Yes. So they don't fly at night. They travel really, really fast, actually. It's incredible. They travel on average about just shy of 100 kilometres an hour, so about 96 kilometres an hour.
Whoa!
And speeds of up to 160 kilometres an hour have been...
Wow, that's...
But they don't travel at night.
No, they don't fly at night.
But what if you order an express pigeon? What if you pay extra for the express pigeon? I want an overnight delivery.
No, it never comes when you think it's going to come. They say overnight, but really it takes 2 days.
Classic pigeons.
Yeah.
Or it'll arrive annoyingly too soon.
Yeah. The pigeon always arrives before I get home from work. It's never as I get home from work or after I get home from work.
Get home and find it on your doorstep, begging for seed. So anyway, you start to get the idea. They can fly so far from where you've released them all the way home, and it really blows my mind.
Yes! How do they achieve it? Stop keeping us in suspense.
That's right. If you took me, 100 kilometres away from home and put me somewhere that I'd never seen before and said, go home, I would have to walk until I found a road. And even then I wouldn't know how to get there. I'd just walk along the road until humans are dumb. Like, these animals are so sophisticated in their navigation. But typically, they can only find their way home in one direction. But something that they've discovered in the domestication is that if you feed them at one end of the journey and then have their loft or their roost at the other end of the journey, then you can get them to reliably fly in two different directions. So you put them in a box, take them somewhere, give them a bit of food, and then release them. They'll fly home, then they'll go, hey, I want a bit of food. So they fly back to where they were, if you let them. So this is a pretty good way of getting a bidirectional pigeon system. So they've actually been used for thousands of years. And one of the earliest documented uses, or so the story goes, was to announce the winner of the ancient Olympics. So, this was around about 3,000 years ago. I learned that Genghis Khan had homing pigeons, and he would use them in battle to send for reinforcements and the like. And they were actually used in the 12th century as part of a regular messenger service throughout the Middle East between Baghdad and Syria. There was a carrier pigeon service called the Great Barrier Pigeongram Service, and it was established in Auckland in New Zealand. And in the late 1800s, parcels and letters transported in this way received the world's first airmail stamps. So that's where that sort of originated. Yeah.
So, but they could only go between two locations, presumably.
Yeah.
So, like, between an island and a major city on the mainland.
That's right, yeah.
How can they... That's crazy. How do they keep their direction just over the ocean?
Oh, well, you're about to learn.
Oh,
You've come to the right
so
episode.
You've built it up so much now that it better be good.
If you just say they have a built-in GPS, I'm going to be so pissed.
Well, they've actually constructed satellites and they've sent them up into the...
Homing pigeons were designed by Garmin. 2000 BC.
We are open for your sponsorship, Garmin.
Hey, please. Homing pigeons were actually used extensively in the World Wars, and I saw a video where someone was telling a story about how useful they were at gathering intel from the air. They said that if you could strap a tiny camera to the chest of the pigeon, you could release them, and then as the pigeon flies home, the camera would be on a timer and it would take a photo of whatever was directly beneath the pigeon. So if you lined the pigeon up between point A, we'll say, the release point, and its home, and on that flight path you knew that there was a big military base, you could time the camera so that, based on the pigeon's speed, when it was over the military base, click, it'd take a photo, and you'd have that intel, and the enemy would be none the wiser, because they'd just think it was a bird flying overhead.
They should have just used drones, though.
Well, it's a good point. You should have told World War I England to use a drone.
Yeah.
That probably was the world's first drone, I suppose.
Yeah, I get it. Yep. Anyway, sorry, Sam asked what altitude they fly at, so answer his question too.
I can't. I didn't look that up.
It's
not really, it's not important. Let's say 60 meters.
I think it's maybe more than that.
It may or may not be the accurate answer, but that's what I'm saying anyway.
It's somewhere between 1 meter off the ground and 100 kilometers off the ground, which, as we know, is the Kármán line, which is outer space. So, here it goes again. Damn it. So you probably know that pigeons are still used today, mainly for pigeon racing, which was actually the inspiration for this show. So
I'm sorry, what?
For this topic?
This is news to me as well.
Yeah, well, for this particular episode.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I was like, wait, idio facto and what? Hang on.
Oh, sorry, I used the wrong word. No, it was the inspiration for this episode.
Idio facto, brackets, pigeon racing.
It was so close to calling it that. I was in Ballarat for a work trip and I was driving past a field and I saw a man with a ute with these funny looking cages on the back, and as I drove past, he lifted the side up on the ute and like hundreds of these pigeons flew out of the back of his ute and across the paddock. And I thought, he's obviously not just doing that just to free some pigeons that he's trapped from somewhere. That's pigeon racing. That got me thinking, I wonder how it works. So I guess the question that's on everyone's minds is, how do they navigate?
Nah, I don't really care.
Well, that's good because I actually don't know.
What? So nobody knows.
Levi, you are the worst. You should have started this with a disclaimer that you
You're
didn't
a massive troll.
No.
You are just a massive troll.
Nobody knows for sure, in the same way that we don't know about non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So scientists that have studied homing pigeons know that they must work on what they call the map and compass model. So it makes sense. If we want to navigate, we need a map to give a layout of the land, and we also need a compass. And we need to know our starting point. So for a homing pigeon, the compass is a number of things. It's the sun, it's the wind, it's their sense of smell, olfactory navigation, and it's noises, familiar noises. But a compass is no good if you don't know where you are. And this is where you need a map. So in the wild, pigeons would leave their nest and fly a long way away, and they'd use landmarks along the way to find their way home. Trees or rivers or rock formations and the like. But most homing pigeons are transported away from their home at ground level in a box that they can't see out of. This means that their mental map is coming from another force that humans can't really feel. And this is where we enter the world of magnetoreception.
That does sound very cool.
That sounds like X-Men.
Was it as good as you were expecting? You waited a long time for it.
Well, yeah. Go on.
Thanks for your enthusiasm.
Well, I'll let you know. I'll let you know once you tell me what magnetoreception is.
We don't entirely know, but at the moment, magnetoreception seems to be one of the best theories as to how these pigeons navigate. So somewhere in the pigeon's body, there are these cells that are sensitive to magnetic fields. We still don't really know where they are, but there are several areas in the pigeon's brain that react when exposed to a magnetic field. And there are also these iron-rich organelles in the cells of the inner ear in the pigeon. So it's sort of postulated that it could be somewhere in the brain, it could be in the inner ear. We don't entirely know yet. Pigeons are actually so adept at detecting magnetic fields that they can detect a magnetic field down to about 186 microtesla.
Wow.
Which we talked about Teslas last week. So this is 0.000186 Teslas. So as you mentioned, a fridge magnet is 0.01 Tesla.
Yeah.
So a fridge magnet is 50 times stronger than the force that a pigeon can detect.
Wow.
So they've actually tested this in the tunnel test. Basically, they got the pigeons they trained the pigeons to fly to one end of the tunnel if there was a magnetic field present, and they got them to fly to the other end of the tunnel if there was no magnetic field present. And they got rewarded with food if they got it right. If they got it wrong, they still got food, but they got a time penalty. So they had to wait for their food. So it was in their best interest to fly to the right end of the correct end of the tunnel fast.
So you took some lessons from that and you gave us a time penalty to find out how pigeons navigated.
But I don't understand why we're being punished.
Well, that's because we're just dumb pigeons and we don't really understand the greater scientific...
Just dumb humans that aren't capable of magnetoreception.
Well, that's true.
But I have a question. What would happen if you put a pigeon in an MRI machine?
Maybe you don't want to put a pigeon in an MRI machine.
They'd be very confused. That's the first thing that would happen.
Sam, I think maybe you need to be the writer for the next Saw movie. That's horrible.
No, I have an actual legitimate question.
Right.
Have they exposed pigeons to like an artificial magnetic field and seen what it does to their...
I watched this other video and there was this lady that was talking about, she's a science communicator, and she was talking about homing pigeons. And she mentioned a study that was done where a magnet was strapped, pretty cruel, a magnet was strapped to a homing pigeon and then they were told to navigate home. Essentially, they were released and the homing pigeon just freaked out and flew around in circles and didn't make its way home.
Oh, I feel so sorry for a pigeon.
But that just means that they're very sensitive to this magnetic field. And
yeah, the poor little sensitive pigeon.
Well, during this tunnel test, they actually got it right somewhere between 55 and 65% of the time, which means that it was better than just guessing.
Not much better.
Not much better, but in this tunnel, there was no sun, there was no smell, there was no visual clues.
Right.
And they were flying in a straight line.
Just magnetic field.
So there was no differential.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. Actually.
There was no increasing or decreasing magnetic fields. Obviously, I think in nature there would be a much more natural way of sensing this magnetic field, and that's how pigeons evolved. So just putting them in a tunnel with either a magnetic field present or not, and them getting it right up to 65% of the time is still pretty impressive.
I mean, the test where they strapped a magnet to the pigeon and it was very confused. If you can replicate those results, then that can pretty definitively say that it's got to do with some sort of magnetism. That
we know that there are several animals that use this magnetoreception.
Right.
Several mammals, even the common domesticated chicken, turtles use magnetoreception, and therefore, judging by these iron-rich organelles in the inner ear and the fact that parts of the pigeon's brain becomes active when you expose it to a magnetic field, and this is measurable, suggests that they are using this magnetoreception as the map component of their map and compass model. Their navigation is a really complex combination of different navigation methods. So they do use this olfactory navigation, so their sense of smell. Apparently certain home lofts have a certain hum, we'll call it a hum, certain noises that guide the pigeon back if they're close enough. Pigeons' sensory organs are very sensitive to this kind of thing. And a combination of this, the sun, the wind, the smell, the noise, and the magnetoreception, means that they're able to make their way home.
Wow.
So I just found this super interesting because we know so much about the world and the universe, but some marvels of nature still remain a mystery to us. And in a way, that's kind of nice, although I am sort of frustrated that there's not a definitive answer.
And so is everyone else. Thank you very much.
But I didn't know that when I chose this topic, so to be fair to me. But I did find something interesting, and this is a fact that you can rely on. Do you think there's any connection between homing pigeons and the internet?
Yes.
I'm only going to say yes because you brought it up.
Righto.
It seems like a very
Good
tenuous
call.
link to bring up if you're not going to explain how they're similar.
Yeah, well, that's good creative thinking. Well, we spoke in your internet segment, Matt, about IPs or internet protocols.
Yes.
I learnt about something called the IP over avian carriers, or IPOAC.
What?
Which was released as a request for comments document, or an RFC document. It was issued by the Internet Engineering Task Force, or the IETF. It was written by D. Weitzman and was released on the 1st of April 1990. Now, do you know what's strange about this date?
It's April Fool's Day.
That's right. So it was April Fool's. So a request for comment is a real thing in the sort of the internet and engineering field. Basically, you're requesting comments from people. But this one in particular was released on April Fool's Day as a bit of a joke. And it was suggesting that maybe a good internet protocol might be just to strap the data to carrier pigeons and have them carry the data around for us.
I mean, it'd probably be faster than NBN.
It's funny you say that because this IPOAC actually had some merit after they tested it in 2001.
What?
Mostly for a joke, but at the time, internet speeds weren't great.
Yeah.
And if you could use a pigeon to carry a hard drive or another storage device, depending on where you wanted them to go and how far away from the host you were, it would actually be quicker to send the pigeon than it would be to wait for the file to download.
Wow. I assume that's no longer true.
It depends on how many pigeons you're using and
how big the hard drive is, I guess.
Exactly. So, yeah, it's quite possible that IPOAC could still be quicker than Australian NBN.
Wow. So obviously everyone's heard of Bigfoot, but have you heard of the Sasquatch?
Yes, I guess is it just another name for it?
It is just another name. What about Yeti?
Yeah.
But that's different, right?
Well, Yeti's very slightly different, but you've heard of the Yeti and the Yowie?
I thought the Yowie was specifically an Australian type of animal.
Well, yeah. What about the Chichunya? Have you heard of that?
No, that's one I haven't heard of.
What about the Almas?
Nope.
What about the Yeren?
Nope.
No, okay. So the Yowie is basically an Australian version of Bigfoot. And Chichunya is a Russian version of Bigfoot, and Almas is a Mongolian version of Bigfoot, and Yeren is a Chinese version of Bigfoot.
Oh.
All are described in basically exactly the same way. They're hairy, bipedal, ape or human-like creatures between 6 and 9 feet, or 1.8 to 2.7 meters tall. They dwell in wilderness areas, they are shy and reclusive, and they leave footprints around the place.
Okay.
So they're often depicted as something of a missing link between apes and humans. Like if you imagine those shirts that have the chimpanzee that slowly morphs into a human over time. Yeah, it's somewhere in the middle of that shirt. And they're considered to be a cryptid. And so a cryptid is the name that's given to a creature whose existence is unlikely and unproven by mainstream science.
Right. It's funny that you're talking about this because I know I stuffed it up and said that racing pigeons was the inspiration for the show, but Bigfoot and cryptozoology was actually the original intent for Ideo Facto, wasn't it, Matt? We were actually just going to do a podcast on this cryptozoology, or animals that sort of aren't real.
Yeah. Well, and we probably could have got a full season out of it at least, because
just about.
I originally wanted to do this episode on cryptozoology as a pseudoscience. Cryptozoology is basically just the study of these cryptids, and crypt comes from kraptos, which is Greek, which means hidden. So it's these hidden animals, and cryptozoology means the study of hidden organisms. Most of the evidence for cryptids is anecdotal, and rarely does any physical evidence pass Occam's razor, meaning that it requires many more assumptions than does the scientific explanation. So we'll look into that further as we go along, but we legitimately could do probably a podcast just on cryptozoology. There are that many cryptids that are being studied, in inverted commas, around the world.
You got me there. I was like, hang on. I'm really interested to know about these studies.
Well, yeah. We'll go through some of the evidence that these people... I'm going to put evidence in inverted commas as well, because it's pretty tenuous.
All right.
So other cryptids, the Loch Ness Monster, Chupacabra, the Bunyip in Australia, and also in Australia, really the search for wild thylacines, or Tasmanian tigers, that's getting close to being considered cryptozoology.
I guess you're right.
We'll probably address that in a future episode.
Yeah, I guess you're right, but it's one of those things that I can understand why people would think that perhaps there are thylacines around. If you're not familiar with it, it's the Tasmanian tiger that was essentially hunted to extinction in Tasmania in, the early 20th century, because it was a threat to European introduced livestock, which is so unfortunate because it would have been an amazing animal. But my point is that Tasmania and parts of Tasmania are still so wild, and there's probably, there are no doubt areas of Tasmania where no human has ever stepped foot in. And so I could understand if there were these still wild thylacines. However, most of the sightings are total hoaxes.
Yes. And I think I almost feel like I need to do an episode on the Tasmanian tiger, or modern Tasmanian tiger searches altogether on its own, because it's a slightly different, but many of the same arguments come up again and again, that are very similar to Bigfoot. So the Bigfoot myth appears to predate the name Bigfoot itself. So Native Americans have many myths regarding humanoid creatures of varying levels of threat, though the name and nature of these creatures varies depending on the part of the continent that they come from. Anthropologists have basically established, however, that most cultures worldwide have some folk stories regarding human-like creatures, some benevolent and others much less so. So, Bigfoot itself, in the late 1950s, a Californian man allegedly found footprints in the Californian wilderness, and he had them plastered. And this was then reported in the local newspaper, and despite many reasons to believe that it was in fact a hoax, it received a lot of attention, and the creature with a big footprint came to be known as Bigfoot. The reasons for it to be a hoax have to do with local politics and people knowing the editor of the newspaper locally and needing a story and that sort of thing. It's an in-depth story, and there's not a whole lot of evidence there. There were reasons to believe that it was a hoax. Anyway, it got a lot of attention, and hunting parties were sent out, and they were unable to find any evidence of any unknown creature. The myth slowly bubbled away for about a decade before what's probably the most famous piece of Bigfoot evidence, again in inverted commas, was made in 1967, and it's called the Patterson-Gimlin film, and you've almost certainly seen this footage.
Yeah.
It's really shaky, and it depicts what looks like a man in a gorilla suit walking away from the camera before looking back and then continuing to walk. Obviously, I'll put a link in the show notes to that film. There's actually a disturbing number of scientific articles attempting to either prove that the figure is definitely not a human in a suit, or that it definitely is a human in a suit.
Really?
I was kind of surprised by the number of, just the sheer number, not necessarily the quality, but the sheer number of papers that look frame by frame at this piece of film. The fact is, it's probably impossible, this far from the event itself, to prove definitively one way or another. So the men involved were Roger Patterson, He died in 1972 and maintained until he died that the film was definitely not a hoax. And the other guy is Bob Gimlin, who was sure that it was real, but in recent years he kind of came to admit that he himself may have been duped by Patterson into thinking that it was a real creature.
Ah.
Anyway, before filming this footage, Patterson had talked for years about filming a documentary about Bigfoot.
Right.
So it is convenient that he happened to run across the only one ever filmed in such detail.
That is very convenient.
In any case, the question is once again of Occam's razor. Given the two competing hypotheses, which requires the fewest assumption? Number one, that a man who wanted to sell film footage was able to procure a gorilla suit and a camera and fabricate this footage, or number two, that the same man luckily came upon a creature that nobody had credibly seen before or since and had the means to film it at the time, which requires the fewest assumptions.
Number one.
Obviously the first one. People point to another more modern series of photos as well, taken in Pennsylvania in 2007 by an automated trail camera owned by a man named R. Jacobs. Wasn't actually able to find out his first name, but Bigfoot researchers, as they call themselves, just call these the Jacobs photos. So these automated trail cameras, you mount them on a tree and they take photos automatically when they detect movement. So there's one photo in particular that is quite compelling, and it depicts a mostly hairless creature sniffing a tree on all fours with really long limbs. There's an organization called the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. They have a mostly online presence, and they've described this creature as an unclassified primate. To be fair, it is a weird-looking thing, and it does appear to have the limbs of a primate.
I don't think I've seen this photo.
I'll put a link in the show notes, and just for your guys' benefit, I will give you the link now so you can actually see.
Yeah, let's have a look.
Oh,
yeah. Creepy looking. So this was in 2007.
2007.
Right.
Yeah.
That is weird looking. Ugh.
It is. It's weird looking, and it looks like a primate thing. I don't know really what it looks like.
It could be a really sick... To me, it looks like if you took a bear and almost shaved it and then gave it mange, I reckon that's what it'd look like.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. The trail camera that we're talking about took at least three photos that evening. One was taken at 8:04 and it has two black bear cubs that are sniffing the same tree. Then at 8:32, so less than half an hour later, two more photos were taken of this unclassified primate with a shape that looks like one of the black bear cubs in the bottom corner, which is often cropped out of the publicity photos that the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization release.
Mm-hmm.
The scientific explanation for these photos, as you said, Levi, is that the adult bear that's with the cubs is infected with mange, which is a skin disease that's caused by parasitic mites, and it causes the loss of hair. If you see a picture of an adult black bear with mange, which I'll put in the show notes and I'll send to you guys right now.
Most importantly, though, did you see that you can actually buy some Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization merch?
I did not.
Awesome.
I think I'll pass on that. So if you check that link, that is...
yes. Awful.
What a black bear with mange looks like. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Looks like...
It is awful.
See, to me, it looks way more like an unclassified primate.
Yeah, right?
It looks like a giant bat. Sort of face. What his face looks like.
It does. It looks as if you, gave a chimpanzee the face of a bat.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it looks like.
Yeah.
Check out the link in the show notes and you'll see. So that's apparently what Bigfoot looks like. There you go.
Creepy.
Yeah. If you look at these photos expecting to see a black bear with mange and not an unclassified primate, then it's obvious that it's a mangy adult black bear and it's with its cubs. In fact, most of the unexplained footprints and sightings of Bigfoot can be attributed to poorly photographed, filmed, or observed black bears. So a 2014 paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society analysed the DNA in many hair samples claimed to be from Bigfoot and other cryptids, but of the 18 samples claimed to be from Bigfoot, 5 were from black bears, 4 were from wolves or dogs, 3 were from cows, as well as a hair from a deer, a porcupine, a horse, a raccoon, a sheep, and a human. So none from Bigfoot, and also none that were unknown.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they were able to find a definitive source for all of the hairs.
Yes, and the match was like as close as you can possibly get. It was definitely the things that we said that it was.
Right.
Also, given that the first major sighting of Bigfoot was in California, on the west coast of the USA, and Bigfoot's big feet have been photographed as far east as Pennsylvania, likely means that there has to be at least more than one.
Yeah.
Unless it can travel vast distances. It also was first sighted, again in inverted commas, in the 1950s, and sightings have happened up until very recently, so it must be very long-lived as well. All of these things add up to make it even less likely. But to go through every small piece of tenuous evidence purported to show undeniable proof of Bigfoot would take a lot longer than we have, and sort of gives it a credence that it doesn't really deserve. From a biology perspective, the major argument against the existence of Bigfoots, is an ecological one. Namely, how does a breeding population of a species of reclusive humanoid creatures subsist on any kind of diet without leaving any trace of their existence over many decades? Like, how many of them are there? How long do they live? How do they breed? How have we never seen any remains of any of them? If you consider other reclusive primates like gorillas and chimpanzees, they maintain really small populations in remote areas, and yet we're still able to track and study them. So what makes big feet so special?
That's right, and I actually am not even so sure, like you're saying big feet as though they're a species, but I think the legend doesn't make it seem like there's this species out there that they all look like big, hairy, tall men with big feet. It almost makes it seem like there's just the one individual that's roaming around.
Yeah, that has been alive for 80 years and
that's right.
Has managed to travel on foot from California to Pennsylvania and comes up all over the place. Like, they've been seen anywhere from, Southern California to remote New York state to, Oregon. Within a matter of weeks of each other, some of these sightings have been reported. So if it's one individual, how is it possibly getting all over the country that quickly? And if it's many individuals, how have we never been able to see any of them ever? The sheer number of assumptions that we'd have to make to account for the existence of a Bigfoot or big feet as a species, it violates logic and Occam's razor and is frankly, in today's world, ridiculous. And yet there are still these organizations that devote all of their spare time to researching these cryptids.
That's ridiculous and such a waste of time when you've clearly just used Occam's razor to decapitate Sasquatch.
Wow, that is Well, as with all cryptids, most of the evidence can be explained by mainstream science. And as the common skeptical saying goes, the plural of anecdote is not data. That's it for this episode of Idiofacto. Forward all suggestions, hate mail, evidence and arguments to idiofacto@gmail.com.
And you can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all of the other social platforms at Idiofacto.
Links are in the show notes.
What are the show notes?
No, I know what they are now. I have used them several times.
Oh, good. Well, you're auditing our work like you said you would.
Somebody has to.
Yeah, well, that's good creative thinking. Thank you to whoever just dropped the fork on the ceramic bowl. That'll be good audio for the podcast.
That's me.
Excuse me while I'm hoping this isn't...
We are still recording, and once again, it seems that my segment is a joke to you.
Yep. Sorry, I just had to have a drink from my bottle.
There you go. The flashback at the start of a bloody CSGO game. Sam ends the segment with a drop fork.
Can't help himself.